Welcome, everyone. This is Heather Noonan. I'm the Vice President for Advocacy with the League of American Orchestras, the national service organization for symphony orchestras throughout this country. And I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on the new rules for protected species and musical instruments. We have a large audience on the computer for this webinar, and we also have a large group of national organizations who are working together to help to bring you the most recent information on this very important subject matter. Before we get into the details, I do just want to review with you a few technical tips for this presentation. You should be listening via computer for your audio, and in order to get the best performance both for what you see on screen and what you hear via the phone, we advise that you close other browser windows and other programs you may have open for the duration of this webinar. Also, please note that all participants are in listen-only mode. However, we are asking you to send us your questions along the way. You'll see a Q&A box on the screen, and if you submit that question, it'll be visible only to me as a moderator. Near the end of our presentation, we'll be presenting as many of those questions as possible to our speakers and see how many answers we can get through in the 1 hour we've got provided for this presentation. I also know that each of the national organizations co-hosting this event, as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, continue to work on web guidance to help you through this process. And as more information becomes available on these topics, we'll be refreshing our guidance there as well. So finally, I just wanted to remind you that you do have resources at your national service organization who are available to help answer and field the questions you have on this topic year-round. These groups, listed on your screen here, also coordinate our work in both discussing the policies that are being created in this area, as well as creating technical assistance like this webinar today. So please do refer back to your national organizations for further information as we move along. And with that, I'd like to hand this over to Carrie Parker at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who will begin our presentation.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carrie Parker. I'm a wildlife biologist and outreach specialist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's International Affairs Program. We want to thank Heather Noonan and the League of American Orchestras for arranging and hosting this webinar today. We're pleased to join you to discuss CITES permits for traveling musicians, in particular, changes to the protected status of rosewood stemming from the recent CITES meeting in South Africa. Our talk today will focus on non-commercial activities such as personal and performance travel with musical instruments. Yesterday, we participated in a webinar with the International Wood Products Association that focused on commercial activities. Our understanding is that that video will be available for future viewing. Next slide. To give you an overview of what we'll talk about today, after introductions, I'll briefly discuss wildlife trade and how that relates to wood products like guitars and other instruments. I'll also give a brief overview of recent changes to the protected status of rosewood stemming from the recent CITES meeting in South Africa. Following that, our expert panel will address questions that have recently been submitted to our office on this topic. And then we'll look forward to taking your new questions in an open discussion. I do ask that you please hold your questions until after we finish our slide presentation. Next slide, please.
You got it.
Oh, great. To get us started, I'm pleased to introduce our expert panel, including 3 members from our leadership team, Tim Van Norman, Chief of our Branch of Permits, Laura Noguchi, Chief of our Wildlife Trade and Conservation Branch, and Anne-Marie Siaka, Supervisory Wildlife Biologist with the Branch of Permits. We're also very fortunate to welcome our subject matter experts on this topic, Anne St. John, Darcy Vargas, and Emma Nelson. Next slide, please. So we're going to jump right into the heart of the matter, which is the international trade of plants and wildlife. Next slide. What do alligator boots, a guitar with a rosewood fretboard, African elephants, and giant pandas have in common? Next slide. Trees, plants, timber, and protected species like rosewood are all commonly traded. They are part of what we commonly refer to as wildlife trade. Wildlife trade is any sale or exchange of wild animal and plant resources by people. This can involve live animals and plants and a diverse range of products, including medicinal ingredients and food. So many of our traded commodities originate from animals and plants. Next. The magnitude of this trade is vast, involving hundreds of millions of individual plants and animals from tens of thousands of species. Most wildlife trade is within national borders, but there is a substantial international trade. Next. With so much pressure on plant and animal resources, it's critical that we monitor our impact to ensure that we do not contribute to species decline. It's so important that we all participate in conservation. So how can musicians be part of conservation? First and foremost, your compliance with wildlife and plant laws will ensure that your lawful, sustainable activities are separate and distinct from those that harm vulnerable wildlife and plant populations. We encourage you to become familiar with the conservation activities that benefit trees, forests, and wildlife in the wild. Ask questions when buying an instrument and be sure to maintain careful records and documentation. We know that all of you participating today care deeply about trees and wildlife, and we thank you. Next. Sorry. I know that some of you are familiar with CITES already, and you've been carefully complying with CITES during your travels and activities for years. So you're familiar with the treaty and how it works. But I want to give a quick overview just in case we have anyone new to this conversation on the phone. Next. It's important to be familiar with and to comply with the CITES Treaty. The Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora is the only international treaty that regulates international wildlife trade for the purposes of conservation. The aim of CITES is to ensure that international trade in specimens of wild animals and plants does not threaten their survival. Next. Currently, 182 countries and the EU are members or parties of the treaty. So, nearly every sovereign country in the world is a member of CITES. And in fact, non-CITES countries that want to trade in CITES species with CITES countries must provide documentation that is equivalent to the requirements under the treaty. Next. Every 3 or so years, the CITES parties gather to make decisions. This meeting is called a Conference of the Parties, or a COP. They review progress in the conservation of listed species, they consider proposals to change protections for species, and they manage logistics and operations, like the budget. This year, in September and October, the 17th Conference of the Parties, or COP17, took place in South Africa. Next. To give you a better idea of where we fit into the picture, the United States is one of the world's largest importers and exporters of CITES-listed species and their products. Trade activities with CITES-listed species are regulated, and some activities with the most vulnerable species are in fact prohibited. But it's not true that CITES bans all trade. That's a misunderstanding. In fact, CITES recognizes that commercial trade may be beneficial to the conservation of species and ecosystems, and to the development of local people when carried out at levels that are not detrimental to the survival of the species in question. To facilitate legal trade and conservation, our office issues upwards of 20,000 permits annually. Next. So when do we get to talk about plants and animals? Roughly 5,000 species of animals and more than 35,000 species of plants are protected by CITES. They are listed in the 3 CITES Appendices, which are literally lists of species. Next. How do the appendices differ? Generally, Appendix 1 listing provides the highest level of protection, including a prohibition on commercial trade, and is reserved for species that are threatened with extinction. Appendix 2 protects species that are vulnerable to overexploitation. Trade in Appendix 2 is regulated and monitored, and commercial trade is allowed, provided certain procedures are followed to ensure that trade is legal and sustainable. As for Appendix 3, while its purpose is to address legal origin, not sustainability, it's still powerful. It includes species protected by at least one country that has requested assistance to help regulate trade, and can be listed unilaterally by a party at any time. Next. While the focus of this talk is CITES, I want to quickly mention a few other laws that come into play. Here in the United States, we have a robust framework of domestic wildlife and plant protection laws. Importantly, the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, and the Lacey Act also regulate activities with wildlife and plants. Next. And the regulations that implement our wildlife and plant protection laws, including CITES, are documented in the Code of Federal Regulations. We call this the CFR for short. You can browse the CFR online by visiting the eCFR. Look for Title 50 Wildlife and Fisheries. The CITES regulations, for example, can be found under Title 50, Part 23. Next. So how does this impact you? It's important to be aware that certain interstate and international activities with wood or wildlife products, including instruments, are protected or regulated under international and domestic law. Before you make plans to acquire a new instrument or travel overseas with an instrument made of protected wood or wildlife species, learn the facts and the rules so that you can make plans to ensure compliance. Next. So how do you comply with these laws? You may be surprised to learn that much of CITES comes down to a system of permits. The backbone of CITES is a permit system that facilitates international cooperation in conservation and trade monitoring. Permits are only issued if the trade is legal and will not threaten a species' survival. Importantly, permits provide a means to balance use and conservation of protected species. Traders must apply for a CITES permit if they want to send out or bring in listed species, including parts and products across international borders. If you bring wildlife into the country, that's an import. If you send wildlife out of the country, that's an export. And if a species is sent across one border and then another, the second and all subsequent crossings are called re-exports. All of these activities are considered trade, even if it's personal. For example, if you own an instrument made of a CITES-listed species and you want to take it out of the country or back into the country, that is a trade activity that may require a permit. By making informed choices and keeping careful records, you can be sure to acquire the permits you need before travel, if needed. Next. Oh, sorry. So what kind of permit do you need? Generally, wildlife and plants are protected under CITES through its 3 appendices. Appendix 1 species, those that are threatened with extinction, may only be traded when both an import from the importing country, an import permit from the importing country, and an export permit from the exporting country are issued. This is the highest level of protection under CITES. Appendix 2 species, those that are vulnerable to overexploitation, may be traded when an export permit or certificate is issued by the exporting country. Appendix 3 species, which are monitored by the CITES parties to ensure their trade is lawful, require an export permit or certificate from the exporting country. And finally, pre-convention specimens, those specimens that were obtained prior to the species receiving protections under the treaty, require certificates for export, but not import. Next. So why are we having this webinar today? Let's get into some current events and discuss changes stemming from the recent CITES Conference of the Parties, which took place in September and October in South Africa. Next. Oh. Effective January 2nd, 2017, the following timber species will be listed in CITES Appendix 2. Koso, aka African rosewood, will be listed under Appendix 2 with no annotation. This means that all parts and derivatives of the species will be regulated. And 3 species of Bubinga will be listed under Appendix 2 with an annotation. I'll talk more about the annotation next. Finally, all species of Dalbergia will be listed under Appendix 2 with an annotation, except for Brazilian rosewood, Dalbergia nigra, which is already listed under Appendix 1 and will continue with those same protections. Next slide. So what is an annotation? An annotation identifies what parts or items are covered or not covered by the CITES listings. So you'll remember that Koso, African rosewood, has been listed without an annotation. That means that all parts and derivatives are covered. However, that is not the case for Bubinga and the newly listed species of Dalbergia. Certain parts and derivatives are covered and require permits, and certain parts and derivatives are not covered and do not require permits. Next. The new listings of Dalbergia and the 3 Bubinga species carry the following annotation. All parts and derivatives are included except A, leaves, flowers, pollen, fruit, and seeds. B, non-commercial exports of a maximum total weight of 10 kilograms per shipment. C, parts and derivatives of Dalbergia cochinchinensis, which are covered by annotation 4. And D, parts and derivatives of Dalbergia originating and exported from Mexico, which are covered by annotation 6. What does this mean? First of all, it means that leaves, flowers, pollen, fruit, and seeds of these species are not covered. They are not regulated. But note that the annotation does not mention timber or wood products. So timber and wood products, including instruments, they may now require permits. Next. Oh, you got it. There has been a lot of interest in paragraph B of the new annotation. Generally, what this paragraph means is that if a specimen of the newly listed Dalbergia or Bubinga is fewer than 10 kilograms and is traded for non-commercial purposes, it will not require a permit. We believe, for example, that many instruments, such as guitars and violins, when imported or exported for non-commercial purposes, such as personal travel, will be exempt from the Appendix 2 permit requirements. It depends on whether the instrument contains 10 kilograms or more of these species of wood and other factors. But even if an item is fewer than 10 kilograms, if it is being exported to be sold, it must be accompanied by CITES documents. Under our regulations, commercial means related to an activity that is reasonably likely to result in economic use, gain, or benefit, including but not limited to profit. However, I want to emphasize that traveling for music performance purposes, even if it's a paid performance, is not considered commercial in this context, provided you're not selling your instrument while you're out of the country. For this reason, there's a possibility that many of you with rosewood instruments will not need a permit to travel with your instruments. Next. Under the new Appendix 2 Dalbergia and Bubinga annotation, if your instrument has less than 10 kilograms of those species, you won't need a permit from our office to travel internationally with your instrument, as long as you don't sell your instrument while you're out of the country. Of course, this assumes the instrument doesn't include other protected species that require permits, such as Appendix 1 Brazilian rosewood. Also remember that the newly listed African rosewood Koso doesn't include the 10 kilogram annotation, so permits may be required for that species. It's important to remember that the annotation for the newly listed Appendix 2 Dalbergia and Bubinga specifies a maximum total weight of 10 kilograms. Some instruments may contain 10 kilograms or more of the protected species. A double bass or a marimba, some drums, it depends on whether the individual instrument contains 10 kilograms or more of protected species. For example, if you have a 50-pound double bass, that's about 22 kilograms, with components made of the newly listed Appendix 2 Dalbergia or Bubinga, we encourage you to do some research on your instrument to determine whether the Dalbergia or Bubinga may comprise 10 kilograms or more of the instrument. If yes, a permit may be required. And remember, it's not the total weight of the instrument, it's the weight of the protected species within that instrument. It's up to you to determine whether your instrument meets the requirements of the 10 kilogram exemption. If it doesn't, you may need a permit from our office, even for personal or performance travel. If in doubt, please contact us so that we can talk about it with you. Now, clearance and inspection procedures at the port may still apply, even if you don't need a permit. I'll talk about that later. And be sure to check with the foreign country for their requirements before you make travel plans. Even if you don't need a permit from us, some countries may have stricter requirements than we do. Next. Another circumstance where you may not need a permit is if you meet the criteria of the personal or household effects exemptions. Your instrument may meet these exemptions provided it only contains Appendix 2 or Appendix 3 species. Appendix 1 species such as Brazilian rosewood, more on that soon, and species listed under the Endangered Species Act don't qualify for these exemptions. Under CITES, the term personal and household effects means specimens that are personally owned and possessed for non-commercial purposes. legally acquired, and they are worn, carried, or included in personal baggage or as part of a household move. So if you're traveling with an instrument comprised of only Appendix 2 or Appendix 3 species, and you have it with you on the plane, either in the overhead compartment or as checked baggage, you don't generally need a permit from our office. Or if you're moving your household to another country and your instruments are with your household items, you generally won't need a permit from our office. We recommend you carefully read the regulations on personal and household effects in the Code of Federal Regulations, and that if you meet those criteria, print out a copy of the regulation and keep it with the instrument for reference purposes. If in doubt, please contact us for guidance. And again, forgive me for being a broken record, but we just can't emphasize enough that you need to check with the foreign country for their requirements before you make travel plans. Not all countries recognize the CITES personal effects exemption, and they may require a permit even if we don't. And once again, clearance and inspection requirements may still apply even if you don't need a permit. I'll talk about those soon. Next slide. So what about those situations when a permit is required? Perhaps your instrument doesn't meet the criteria for Appendix 2 Dalbergia or Bubinga, or you don't meet the criteria for the personal effects exemption. Perhaps a foreign country you are visiting doesn't honor the personal effects exemption, so you need a permit. Perhaps your instrument includes Appendix 1 Brazilian rosewood or ESA protected wildlife such as ivory or tortoiseshell. One option is the musical instrument certificate or the traveling exhibition certificate. To ease the paperwork burden on musicians traveling with musical instruments made from CITES listed species, the United States put forward a proposal at the 16th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to implement a passport program that would facilitate the frequent, non-commercial, cross-border movement of musical instruments for purposes including, but not limited to, personal use, performance, paid and unpaid, display, and competition with the issuance of just one document. A musical instrument certificate is a passport-like certificate for musical instruments that is issued to individuals. To be eligible for this certificate, your primary residence must be in the United States. A traveling exhibition certificate is a passport-like certificate for musical instruments that is issued to orchestras and ensembles. To be eligible for this certificate, the orchestra or ensemble must be based in the United States. Certificates issued may be valid for up to 3 years and are intended for multiple border crossings for non-commercial purposes. Remember, the instruments are not being offered for sale or being sold while outside the United States. Next. Next slide, please. So let's say you've determined that you need a permit. I want to review how to apply for permits from our office. The process begins with filling out a permit application form. Application forms are available from our website. Here's the URL where you can look up the appropriate form. Next. How do you apply for a musical instrument certificate? Submit application 3-200-88 to our office along with the processing fee. If you are applying for a traveling exhibition certificate on behalf of an orchestra, band, or other ensemble, you use the same form, 3-200-88. Remember, these certificates may be valid for up to 3 years and are intended for multiple border crossings for non-commercial purposes. So the instruments are not being offered for sale or being sold while outside the United States. Now, speaking of selling instruments, I know that many musicians are interested in purchasing instruments from overseas or selling and shipping instruments to a foreign buyer. Remember, that activity is considered commercial, so a permit is always required, and you can't use a musical instrument certificate for that. In that case, you need a different form, so submit application form 3-232 to our office. Next. So what sort of documentation do we ask for in the applications? For any type of application, we always need to know the scientific name of each timber and wildlife species. Multiple tree species are commonly called rosewood, so we need to know exactly which one. We need to know the scientific name, such as Dalbergia cochinchinensis. We'll also need to know about your instrument. What type of instrument do you have? And when was it manufactured? We also need to see evidence that the instrument was lawfully acquired and the timber was lawfully imported. so copies of receipts or invoices or a notarized statement. If the instrument was previously imported, we'll be looking for copies of foreign CITES permits and customs paperwork. Next. Now you'll remember that Brazilian rosewood is different. It's listed as Appendix 1 because it's not just vulnerable to overexploitation, it's threatened with extinction. It's been listed under Appendix 1 since June 1992. That hasn't changed. A CITES certificate is always required. For Brazilian rosewood, we'll be looking for proof that the instrument was made with wood that was harvested before the species was listed under CITES, such as an invoice or foreign CITES pre-convention certificate. Again, I emphasize that you need to check with the foreign country for their requirements. They may have even stricter requirements for Brazilian rosewood and other species. Here's the URL for their contact information. Next. We briefly mentioned the Endangered Species Act earlier. I want to quickly touch on instruments that may have tortoiseshell or ivory components. Tortoiseshell is derived from the hawksbill sea turtle, which is protected under Appendix 1 of CITES as well as the United States Endangered Species Act. This species is threatened with extinction. If your instrument contains tortoiseshell, you may or may not be able to get a permit depending on whether your instrument meets certain criteria. You must be able to demonstrate that the tortoiseshell qualifies as an ESA antique or as pre-ESA. This evidence could be in the form of a qualified appraisal or documentation showing the manufacturing date of the instrument. If your musical instrument containing tortoiseshell does not meet these criteria, you are unlikely to be issued a permit to travel internationally with it. Please contact us for guidance if you have questions about a particular instrument. Next. I also want to mention instruments that may have elephant ivory components. African elephants are being poached at unprecedented levels to supply the illegal ivory trade, and the United States is among the largest markets for illegal ivory. Effective July 6, 2016, we implemented a near total ban on commercial trade in African elephant ivory to ensure that U.S. domestic markets do not contribute to the decline of elephants in the wild. Commercial trade with African elephant ivory is generally prohibited. However, individual musicians may qualify for musical instrument certificates, and orchestras and ensembles may qualify for traveling exhibition certificates if the ivory in their instruments meets certain criteria. If your instrument includes African elephant ivory, you must be able to demonstrate that the ivory was legally acquired and removed from the wild prior to the listing of the African elephant under CITES, February 26, 1976. If your instrument includes Asian elephant ivory, you must be able to demonstrate that the ivory qualifies as ESA antique or pre-ESA. This proof could be in the form of a qualified appraisal or documentation that shows the manufacturing date of the instrument. If your instrument containing ivory does not meet these criteria, you are unlikely to be issued a permit to travel internationally with it. If you have an instrument with elephant ivory components, please review our What Can I Do With My Ivory webpage for details and instructions. If in doubt about a particular instrument, contact us for guidance. And remember, check with the foreign countries you intend to visit to learn their requirements. Next. Now, I've covered a lot of information, and as you move forward with this process, you may run into questions. If you're not sure of the CITES status for a particular species, you can look it up under the CITES Species Database. Here is the URL. Same with the Endangered Species Act. Please visit the Endangered Species Program website. We're going to cover quite a few questions in the next portion of our talk, but remember that you can always reach out to us if you have a question by sending an email to managementauthority@fws.gov. Next. A few notes on the logistics of applying for applications. Please plan ahead. Application processing may require 45 days or more. We go as fast as we can, but the process does take time. We are unable to accept digital applications or payments at this time. Please submit a hard copy of your application along with a check or money order. Keep copies of everything for your records and reference. Next. A few notes about application forms. Instructions are on the form. Complete every question. If a question isn't relevant to your situation, write NA. If in doubt about something, include a cover letter explaining your situation. Applications that arrive without complete information or without the processing fee may require additional processing time. Next. I've talked about permit requirements under CITES, but other important requirements under the treaty and our regulations are clearance and inspections at the port of entry or exit from each country. We encourage you to please reach out to our partner offices and agencies for details on their requirements. Next. Please reach out to the inspection agencies to ensure you are following appropriate procedures at the port. For any product that includes wildlife components, such as mother of pearl or tortoiseshell or ivory, even if it also contains protected timber species, clearances and inspections are conducted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement. By the way, this does not include cowbone, which isn't considered wildlife. For any wood or wood products that don't contain wildlife components, clearances and inspections are conducted for export and re-export by USDA APHIS, and for import by the Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection. A good place to start is to contact USDA APHIS. Here is their contact information. Next. Next up, we're going to talk through some of the questions that you've already submitted to our webinar hosts. I'll introduce the question, and either I or our expert panel will respond. Following these questions, we'll welcome your additional questions in our open discussion. Next. All right, the first one I'm actually going to answer. So, does my instrument need a permit when I travel with it? It does not have CITES listed wildlife components like ivory or snakeskin. However, it does have Appendix 2, Dalbergia or Bubinga. So to review, this gets back to paragraph B of the new Dalbergia and Bubinga annotation. Generally, what this paragraph means is that if a specimen of the newly listed Appendix 2, Dalbergia or Bubinga, is fewer than 10 kilograms and is traded for non-commercial purposes, it will not require a permit. And remember, it's not the total weight of the instrument. It's the weight of the protected species within that instrument. So we believe that many instruments, such as guitars and violins, when imported or exported for non-commercial purposes, such as personal travel or paid performance, will be exempt from the Appendix 2 permit requirements. It depends on whether the instrument contains 10 kilograms or more of these species of wood. It's important to remember that this annotation specifies a maximum of 10 kilograms of the protected species. Some instruments may contain more than 10 kilograms of the protected species. A double bass or a marimba, some drums, it depends on the individual instrument and how much of the protected species is in that instrument. But even if the Appendix 2 Dalbergia or Bubinga in an instrument is less than 10 kilograms, if it is being exported to be sold, it must be accompanied by CITES documents. If the Appendix 2 Dalbergia or Bubinga is 10 kilograms or more, but one of the foreign countries you are visiting doesn't honor the personal effects exemption, it must be accompanied by CITES documents. If the instrument includes an Appendix 1 species, such as Brazilian rosewood, it must be accompanied by CITES documents. If the instrument includes an ESA-listed species, such as ivory or tortoiseshell, it must meet specific criteria and be accompanied by CITES documents. And a reminder, once again, to check with the inspection agencies in the foreign country on their requirements. Let's move on to the next question. Will the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service accept permit applications in advance of the implementation date?
Afternoon. This is Tim Van Norman, the Chief of the Branch of Permit. Yes, we will accept applications in advance of the implementation date. We'll strive to try to respond to that application as quickly as possible and to issue permits before the implementation date. But we do ask that you bear with us. Depending on the number of applications that we get in, we're anticipating we're going to get slammed. So please, think ahead. Apply as soon as you have the opportunity. Thank you.
All right, next question, please. How will shipments in transit on the effective date of the new timber listings be treated on import to the U.S.?
Good afternoon. This is Ann St. John. I'm with the Wildlife Trade and Conservation Branch here in the Management Authority. With regard to this question, the effective date of the new listings is January 2nd, 2017, as Carrie had noted, And so that means that shipments arriving or departing countries for international trade on that date are subject to CITES controls. So for shipments coming into the United States that arrive on or after January 2nd, if they do not have CITES documents with them, they may be held up and eventually refused clearance. But we will consult with the foreign country to determine if it's appropriate to accept a retrospective document. But as we noted, the effective date of the listing is January 2nd. Thank you.
Next question, please. How long will permit application processing generally take?
This is Tim again. We will certainly process applications as quickly as we can. We have our office deals with a large number of applications, and so with a variety of different species and activities, so we'll try to work with it as quickly as possible. We just, again, as I said earlier, request your assistance and your patience with us getting through these applications.
Next question, please. Will imports or exports for repairs or warranty work for instruments only with Appendix 2 rosewoods require permits?
This is Ann St. John again. So with regard to instruments that are imported or exported for repairs, if the repair is done for free or under warranty and there's no fee associated with it, we in the United States are considering that a non-commercial activity. If there is a fee associated with the repair, that would be a commercial activity and subject to CITES controls. And as I noted, this is our interpretation, and we're continuing to consult with the CITES Secretariat and other CITES parties to ensure that that we have a firm understanding of the requirements from other parties as well.
Thank you, Ann. Next question. What about the instruments I already have? Are they pre-convention? How do I document my instruments to make sure they will be considered pre-convention?
So any instrument that was manufactured prior to January 2nd, 2017 would be considered pre-convention. Documenting that really is going back to any kind of documentation that you have on when that instrument was manufactured. Instruments that were manufactured after January 2nd may be constructed with pre-convention wood, but those are things that we'd have to look at in communication with the manufacturer. When did they get the wood? Where did it come from? So for now, any instrument that you have in your hands right now would be considered pre-convention instruments. Thank you.
Next question. Where the U.S. is concerned, will the treatment of non-commercial transportation of musical instruments, such as personal effects or as cargo, for an orchestra or ensemble change in any way from current practice? For cargo, will all species of Appendix 2 Dalbergia be required to be listed on a traveling exhibition certificate that contains other CITES protected plant and animal material?
This is Tim again. As Ann had mentioned earlier, we're still in consultation with other CITES parties to confirm how we're dealing with cargo shipments of instruments being exported for non-commercial transportation or transport. So we're still working on that. We are looking at ways to minimize the impact on the permitting process for orchestras. Certainly for personal effects, with instruments that only contain Dalbergia or Bubinga, where there is that 10-kilo exemption, if the instrument is under 10 kilos or the wood that's being, the listed wood that's included in that instrument is under 10 kilos, then no permit would be required. It's not covered under CITES, and you can travel with those. Likewise, instruments that are greater than 10 kilos or contain greater than 10 kilos of the protected wood and is being exported for as personal effects or household moves, you may be eligible for those exemptions. But again, we need to be able to consult with the importing country to make sure that they also accept that personal effects or household move. So we'll continue to work with the importing countries, the EU, Japan, others, to make sure that we are all on the same, have the same interpretation of the annotation. And we'll try to get that out to everyone as quickly as we can. Thank you.
Next question, please. What administrative or regulatory steps would be required for the U.S. to adjust its personal effects exemption to encompass Appendix 1 species in musical instruments?
This is Laura Noguchi. We will publish a proposed rule coming up in the coming year to incorporate changes to our CITES regulations resulting from CoP17 and looking at other issues that have arisen in the last couple of years where we might need to make changes to our regulations. So that will be a public process, and that's the place where we would change the way our personal effects exemption is currently crafted. So you and others would have an opportunity to comment on that and provide input.
Thank you, Laura. Next question, please. Does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have advice regarding harmonizing the interpretation of the non-commercial annotation across CITES parties?
This is Ann St. John again. So there is a working group that works during this intersessional period. The next CITES COP is not anticipated to be held until 2019. So we have several years to work on the interpretation of these listings and ensure that we're effectively implementing them. During this interim period, there's a working group in the CITES Standing Committee, which is called the Annotations Working Group. And that working group is tasked with looking at the implementation of annotations and identifying issues or places where there might be need for an amendment. So this working group will be looking specifically at this new annotation and may be able to provide guidance during this intersessional period. Additionally, we will continue, as we've noted, we'll continue to consult with other CITES parties and continue to produce guidance to put on our website.
Thank you, Ann. Next question. A related question. Harmonization across CITES parties remains a serious concern. Will implementation of the musical instrument certificate be considered during any interim CITES committee meetings?
Again, there will be opportunities to look at some of these issues within the CITES Standing Committee. That's the body that guides the CITES parties during the interim period between COPs. And so there may be opportunities to analyze the implementation of the musical instrument certificate and the process through that venue.
Thank you, Ann. Next slide. Before we move into the next portion of the webinar, I want to remind you to please feel free to reach out to us with questions and concerns. And as for this next portion where we will welcome your questions, we may not be able to field every question today. However, just so you know, we are in the process of updating our Evergreen website resources and fact sheets in preparation for the effective date of the listing. And now I'll turn the conversation over to Heather and we'll welcome your additional questions.
Thank you very much, Carrie, and thanks to everyone at Fish and Wildlife for providing such thorough background information and also some preliminary answers to the questions that were submitted. I also, in looking at the questions coming into us, the most common one that we're seeing is, how can I access this webinar after today, since it is chock full of information. And so we are recording the webinar and the PowerPoint presentation, and each of the host organizations will have access to it, be able to post it online, and we'll also be sure to get a message out to all of you as participants when that recorded webinar is available. I also know we've received several questions about a place where people could centrally see some of these links to fish and wildlife information. And just to point out, on the website of the League of American Orchestras at americanorchestras.org, we do have a hub of resources, particularly on the non-commercial travel piece, where you can centrally access the existing fish and wildlife resources as well as some of the information that we've gathered over the process of using the musical instrument certificate. So to jump into some of the more specific questions we've received over the past 45 minutes or so, you just answered a couple of questions about harmonizing across CITES parties that were specific to the non-commercial travel. But we're seeing some questions about the harmonization where commercial transportation is concerned. And so in particular, we've had a couple of folks asking about China, for instance, in which they're finding they don't have a process in place yet for the new Dalbergia requirements. How would you advise folks pursue some clarification on what happens in the coming weeks where a CITES party may not be fully up to speed yet on their documentation process?
This is Laura Noguchi. As Anne mentioned, I think, earlier, and Carrie, the listings do go into effect on January 2nd. And we will expect items coming into and out of the United States to have documents. If there are countries, which we are learning that there are countries who are not ready to implement this yet and are not issuing CITES documents, we will not be able to accept those shipments without a CITES document. So at this point, we are working with other management authorities. We encourage you to, in particular, work with China if you know that that's a problem and you need to export something from China. It's their management authority that needs to develop the necessary procedures.
Thank you. The next question is related to something that might straddle commercial and non-commercial use, and that is for shipments of instruments that are coming into the U.S. and are intended to be displayed at a U.S. trade show or some other event. Is that considered to be a commercial or non-commercial shipment?
This is Tim. It would be considered a commercial shipment. They would need to have a CITES document, either a traveling exhibition certificate or traveling under an ATA carnet. Both of those would allow for the issuance of a single document by the exporting country to bring it into the United States and return it back to the country of origin. If they don't have one of those documents, traveling exhibition or a CITES document working with an ATA carnet, then they would need to have a re-export certificate issued by by the Fish and Wildlife Service in order to re-export those instruments back to the country of origin.
Thank you. Where non-commercial transportation is concerned, the Conference of Parties also included a conversation around streamlining and harmonizing for the musical instrument certificate. We do have some questions coming in about whether this frequent cross-border non-commercial movement will see any changes upcoming as a result of what was discussed at the Conference of Parties.
So I think basically what happened at the last Conference of the Parties is trying to consolidate how we're viewing the musical instrument certificates. Some of the issues that had come up that we addressed was looking at paid performances versus non-paid performances, and the parties agreed that those paid performances would qualify under a musical instrument certificate. So we'll continue to work with countries in implementing this, certainly trying to encourage other countries to implement the musical instrument certificate so that their musicians are able to move quickly across international borders with their instruments without having to get multiple permits for both import and export.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have, among those who are participating in the webinar today, we have those who are most frequently dealing with non-commercial travel, which are the users and purchasers of the instruments. We've got folks who are working at the wholesale level and at the retail level. And so we're seeing a few questions across those areas. So one of them has to do with just determining what wood is in the musical instrument, and also documenting pre-convention status. Since only the limited subspecies of Dalbergia were previously listed, it sounds like there are a number of folks who say, we don't have currently have paperwork or historic paperwork. Obviously, scientific testing of the wood is beyond the means of most folks. What do you advise around gathering documentation for that material or finished products when folks are pursuing it for the first time?
So this is Tim again. So the first step obviously is determining that the instrument, when the instrument was manufactured, and that would tell how old that instrument is. We recognize that instruments that were manufactured some time ago, the manufacturer may not be around, or those people that were there didn't really identify what species of rosewood was being utilized. So we do have the ability to identify, at a species level or the genus level, so either as Dalbergia or, and I've forgotten the scientific name for the Bubinga, but the genus for the Bubinga. Instruments that were manufactured more recently, it may very well be that the manufacturer has a better understanding of what species they used, and we're certainly encouraging. We're encouraging now, but we will require manufacturers to identify species as we move forward in the permitting process after January 2nd. So we recognize the difficulties of identifying wood species once the product has been manufactured, and we'll work with the applicant, but we do have the ability to consider at the genus level and not go down to the actual species of the wood being used.
Okay, thank you. I'm seeing a number of questions that are very specific to specific parts of the forum, both on the commercial side and non-commercial travel. You previously posted several different ways in which folks can reach out to Fish and Wildlife on those specific questions. Do you want to more finely direct questions related to commercial versus non-commercial transportation?
No, we're happy to receive questions of any type or stripe to managementauthority@fws.gov. This is Carrie again. I manage that account with Darcy's help, and if we're not able to answer the question ourselves, we forward it along to the appropriate subject matter expert or decision maker. But that's the best place to start when you're contacting us on this issue.
Terrific. To go back to the Dalbergia annotation, I'm seeing a bit of confusion about the 10 kilogram weight limitation. The first is, just to be absolutely clear, exceptions to the permit requirements are where the 10 kilogram weight limitation comes into play are only related to non-commercial transportation. If it is commercial transportation, there is no exemption from permitting if commerce is concerned and it's less than 10 kilograms. Is that correct?
Heather, it's Ann St. John again. Yes, that is correct. That paragraph B of that annotation, which is the exception for maximum total weight of 10 kilograms, is for non-commercial exports, non-commercial trade only. And I think we had noted previously, it is, despite the fact that the annotation reads as non-commercial exports, as you know, at the COP, we sought and received clarification that that is, in fact, exports and imports and re-exports.
Great. Yes, thank you. And also for everyone who's on the line, the U.S. exercised a great deal of leadership at the Conference of Parties to pursue that clarification. The annotation is still fairly complex and a bit ambiguous in some regards. What I heard you saying today related to cargo shipments is that the thing to pay attention to is the quantity of species in the instrument, not the overall weight of the instrument or the total shipment. Is that correct?
That is, in fact, our interpretation. We are, in the United States, we are intending to interpret that 10-kilogram weight limit as pertaining only to the protected species and not the item as a whole.
Okay. Thank you very much. We are having a few questions that relate to the port procedures and customs-related issues. I know this gets into more of the enforcement side of things, but to the degree that you could you just clarify for folks where they can go for more information about the designated ports? Also, some questions about what happens if, of course, unintentionally, an item does not have a permit and is found to have a rosewood species in it. What is the customary protocol at the border in those cases?
So, as Carrie noted in the PowerPoint presentation, for items that include wildlife, including non-protected wildlife like mother of pearl, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will inspect and clear those shipments. Additionally, the Fish and Wildlife Service is able, through an MOU with USDA APHIS, our inspection authorities, are able to inspect and clear shipments that include both CITES protected plants and wildlife. So, for example, if it's an instrument that has one of the CITES listed rosewood species and mother of pearl, Fish and Wildlife Service inspectors can clear that shipment. And so on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement website, there is information concerning the designated ports for wildlife. Additionally, the U.S. Department of Agriculture maintains the list of designated ports for CITES protected plant species. And so there's a bit of a division of labor between the U.S. Department of Agriculture Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, and Customs and Border Protection with regard to imports and exports of plant shipments. But USDA APHIS is the holder of the information concerning the designated ports and the various procedures that both of those agencies use for inspection and clearance of shipments.
This is Tim. In the PowerPoint, there was one slide that talked about port inspections and clearances, and there's some contact information there for USDA, both the website as well as a telephone number to help in addressing those questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're nearing the end of our time available for this event, and we have a very robust list of questions that have come in throughout the presentation. I understand from Fish and Wildlife that as quickly as is possible, you're working on dedicated resources on the topic, particularly of the Dalbergia listing, that would be made available on your website. And we talked with you in advance about sending to you all the questions received during this event to help inform the guidance that you issue publicly. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our participants before we conclude?
Yes, I'll just, please do, Heather, send us along any questions that have come through that we haven't been able to address today. We are working on a Q&A that we can make available from our website, as long as updates to our actual web page and fact sheets, so that those will be more useful to you going forward. But mostly we just want to thank you again, Heather, and the League of American Orchestras and all of the partners that made this webinar possible for us. This is an invaluable opportunity for us to connect with stakeholders, and we appreciate it. So thank you for all of your interest and for everyone's activities to comply with the laws and procedures that protect wildlife and plants.
Perfect, and thanks to everyone at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for being available for this event today, and also our ongoing collaboration and answering further questions and shaping for future policy. I'd also just like to remind everybody you will have access to a recorded version of this webinar. I also understand that yesterday's webinar that related primarily to commercial engagement with these issues by the International Wood Products Association, will also be available to anyone who might not have been able to participate in that event as well. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for your participation. Please be reminded to stay in touch with your contacts at your national service organizations with further questions, and we will be sure to send you more information as it becomes available. Thank you.